Brought to the world in 1994 by Origin Systems and developed by Looking Glass Technologies, System Shock is a highly influential title directed by Doug Church and produced by Warren Spector. Continuing their work from Ultima Underworld 2, the game can tentatively be called a dungeon crawler, but it stands out even more than the Underworld games do thanks to the sci-fi theming and the innovation it brings to the table. As such, it's common to attribute the game with the birth of the Immersive Sim genre, which I partially agree with. Sort of. For the sake of making this video and many other ones less terrible, let's pull off the band-aid now and have the Immersive Sim nightmare genre discussion before we continue. The existence of the Immersive Sim genre is actually a contentious one. Multiple times I've heard people say it isn't actually real, and while I find that nonsensical, I understand why the belief sticks around. Not only is it an oddly insular genre containing a mere 24, if not fewer entries, depending on where you draw the line, but drawing said line can be incredibly difficult due to the oblique characteristics that define these games. The healthy thing to do is to adopt the I know some when I see some mindset and simply enjoy the cool video game in front of you, but that is not the MO of this channel. Starting with the word immersion, we are already in deep water as that is a highly subjective part of the video game experience with enough nuance for a book or two. To get a leg to stand on, I find that it helps to contemplate the design goals of System Shock. The goal of note in this context is taking a stand against video game abstraction. The capabilities of current technology has always been at odds with the ravenous minds of game designers who will stop at nothing until they've surpassed the depths of the lame-ass universe they are forced to inhabit. Sadly for them, the universe is not keen on competition, so to get a game out the door that can run on things people can afford, compromises have to be made. Which brings us to the concept of video game abstraction, the idea of taking shortcuts in part of the experience in order to make sure the rest of it can happen at all. These compromises take many forms, but level design is the one of interest to us at the moment. Making good level design that still feels like a believable environment is an evergreen problem in game design, but back in the before times you couldn't really make the choice even. It was close to complete abstraction or nothing. Something which came to define video games as a medium for decades. Enter System Shock, standing upon the shoulders of the Ultima Underworld duology and ready to take a swing at the status quo. It's evident that the devs wanted the game to feel as believable as their engine could possibly allow. Instead of just being a set of linear levels full of monsters, Citadel Station's levels are pieces of a larger whole that each serve their own distinct purpose within the narrative. But even at the time, they recognized that the world they were making would not hold up to full scrutiny. There are 0 toilets on this space station, so the game's antagonist, SHODAN, has been busy rebuilding the environments before the game begins. Even so, the fruits of the team's efforts are evident. You can find various pieces of furniture and clutter that informs the broad intent of the space you're video gaming your way through. There's a radiation treatment room on the reactor level, for example, and up on the executive level there's an ATM and a fancy cinema decorated using space itself as a backdrop. This contrasts well with the ensuing chaos, making it clear that SHODAN has turned the station into her domain and that this space does not belong to humanity anymore. So, that covers the immersion half of Immersive Sims, which fully applies to System Shock. It's a game that put in a frankly unheard of level of environmental detail into its design to better engage the player and immerse them in the experience. But as other genres caught up to this level of environmental detail, the genre in turn developed further and left System Shock in the dust. The simulation part of Immersive Sims argues that deep systemized simulation pairs well with and enhances a detailed world. Instead of presenting a clear challenge and expecting a singular result from the player, they instead incorporate interlocking systems which then need to be utilized together in creative ways to create a valid result. Stuff like stacking boxes, breaking in through back doors, bribing NPCs to help you, hacking turrets, putting shrapnel mines on rats. Devs also started recognizing these solutions by offering small acknowledgements to the people engineering particularly crazy ones, which I find to be a delightful sort of reward. It's like the devs congratulate you for stretching the game's systems to its limits or call you an idiot for thinking you outsmarted them. Deathloop giving you an achievement for using the traditional 0451 code that originated in this game on the first locked door is a fun example of the latter. Either reading of the player-dev relationship humanizes the experience and is part of why I love Immersive Sims so much. But that's far off in the future. Back here in 1994, when Beanie Babies walked the earth, System Shock only kinda sorta qualifies. The seedbed for complex systems is there, but the final result isn't tight enough for it to be engaging. We have stuff like temporary buffs, various hazardous barrels, a riot shotgun that can push enemies around, the ability to tune energy weapons to improve their impact at greater cost of energy, and a couple of mobility abilities. Not to mention enemies that explode, doors that can be hacked, tranquilizer ammo, shortcuts that can be unlocked, and more grenade types than I've ever seen in a video game before or since. Sadly, this doesn't really come into play as well as you would hope. When I read off that list, your mind was probably alight with the possibilities these ideas represent. But due to the way the game is balanced, and thanks to how the enemies are implemented in the claustrophobic environments, it's less about being clever and more about being quick on your feet and holding a functioning weapon. The most impressive thing I managed to do during my let's play of the game, which you should check out over on my other channel, link below, was to set a trap with a mine to counter an ambush I knew was coming. But this was thanks to knowledge I carried from my first playthrough and not something I actually did during said first playthrough. What we end up with is a game with a lovingly detailed environment that still has the short-term complexity of Doom. In the long term, System Shock has some cerebral kick to it, but with the 700 enemies you dispose of in a playthrough, not a lot of them require much thought besides blam blam blam. That's not to say that the game isn't still a hefty achievement, but its successors did it better. That's the price of trailblazing, making room for great things you yourself might not be a part of. Now to get there, we still need to actually start this game. Of course, we can't do that until we talk about the game's interesting custom difficulty system, which is yet another trailblazing feature that sadly gets very little play, even now. Before starting a new game, the player has to select their desired difficulty in the following 4 categories: combat, puzzles, mission, and cyber. Each one can be set to a value of 0 to 3, which roughly translates to not present, easy, normal, and hard. Having the 4 distinct parts of the game offer such granularity is a wonderful set of options, but I find the existence of difficulty 0 to be particularly interesting. In essence, it means that the aspect in question is effectively removed from the equation. At combat difficulty 0, enemies have their AI turned off and die in one hit, puzzles are instantly solved, cyberspace has less momentum in its controls with no time limit, but most interestingly of all, the plot is almost entirely removed as there are no logs and all the different floors are all readily available. Combine all of these and the game essentially goes into debug mode and lets you walk through it in 15 minutes unhindered. I wouldn't recommend doing that, nor would I recommend combat difficulty or mission difficulty above normal for a first playthrough, but having these options available is a big positive. As is tradition, this video is written from the perspective of everything set to normal, so let's get to it. The titular System Shock is starting the game and instantly having your senses be assaulted by this godforsaken interface. It consists of a layered status meter for energy usage, fatigue, and chi waves in the top left, the y-axis slider and the interactive body position diagram in the top center, health and energy meters in the top right, 10 hardware attachment activation buttons in the far left and far right, 2 display screens with 5 accompanying selection buttons each in the lower left and lower right, and finally, a multi-purpose inventory display in the lower center. To better understand this bizarre display, one has to remember that the original release didn't have mouse look and expected you to turn by clicking on the sides of the display window and look up and down using the slider. Thanks to the enhanced edition, this is no longer the case, as the game can be played in full screen mode and can easily be traversed like a normal FPS. The same cannot be said for the interface, which is still highly dependent on cursor interactions, even if you spend the time to craft the most unhinged keybinds you can think of. As such, the game constantly needs you to disable mouse look and click around in order to activate stuff, manage inventory, or change the corner displays. As long as you have a hotkey for mouse look, select weapons with a scroll wheel and set auto pickup to clicking the mouse wheel so you can avoid dragging every single item to your inventory, it's generally not that bad. But needing to manually reset the corner displays and inventory screen each time you check out a data log gets very tiring. To the game's credit, it does eventually swap back to the display you were on in certain circumstances, but oftentimes it takes so long that I did it myself before the game had a chance to, just because you get conditioned to do it manually if you want your important information back as soon as possible. I wish there was a way to set a display reset to a button so you could easily revert the displays to what you consider standard. Sadly, that's not an option, so you simply have to learn how to navigate this interface while hopefully not accidentally priming a grenade like I somehow managed to do. Oh wait, maybe that's radiation. I'm glad I'm paying attention. Speaking of paying attention. I'm good at my job. With the interface internalized, you are free to take in the atmosphere of System Shock, which is off to a strong start with the iconic medical deck theme. The soundscape is mostly composed of the groovy techno soundtrack combined with the sounds of the various cybernetic monstrosities patrolling the station. But the game also knows when to pull it back and channel the spirit of a haunted washing machine instead. The track of the executive level and its mad flute is a particular highlight, I find. Your mileage will vary on how well the digitized farts and cowbells in part of the MIDI instrumentation works for you, but this is what the game sounds like on a modern computer, and we simply have to live with that. Of course, the actual issue with the game's sound is how goddamn loud it is. Even at 25% volume, the sound effects can be overpowering, so don't repeat my mistake and kick it down to 10. Otherwise, the game is going to sound like this. The worst offender is this machine from the bridge, which you should lower your volume for before I play the clip. Ready? It all comes together to make it feel as 90s as possible, like you're playing as Johnny Mnemonic roaming through the back alleys of the Matrix while the hardware handling audio still has no idea what the composers Gredlo Piccolo and Tom Rees are trying to accomplish and just makes blind guesswork. I like it, but there's definitely room for improvement. Graphically speaking, I'm pretty content with what's on display here. The game's geometry is simplistic but well textured and varied, leading to each floor having its own distinct look. Outside of boxes, the objects and enemies populating the maps are created with sprites that always face the player. Even with such low resolution, each one clearly communicates what it's supposed to be. The only hiccup is that looking down on enemies makes them rotate to face you like you're on even ground, which looks very odd whenever it occurs. But hey, they got transparency effects working, so consider that a fair trade. As I alluded to before, System Shock is more complicated in the long term than it is in the short term. In order to progress, the game asks you to explore to find clues in the various logs strewn about each floor and combine them with the emails you are provided with and whatever odd piece of interactable machinery can be found. You do this to puzzle out each of the game's 5 core objectives, most of which offer a fair amount of freedom when completing them, even if the solutions are predetermined. The first objective, disabling the mining laser, revolves around doing a combination of things on levels 2 and R, both of which can be accessed after clearing level 1 at the start of the game. But doing so opens up the way to level 6, meaning you have full access to all previous levels beforehand. These can all be explored as the player wishes, either to simply procure equipment or to get started on later objectives early. This level of freedom combined with the need to immerse yourself in the game's world to make progress is one of the game's great strengths. Certain pieces can feel obtuse however, so I don't feel bad for having looked things up every so often, and neither should you, frankly. Zooming in a bit, let's talk about exploring one of these floors. I'm picking level 1 since it's relatively large without being all too complicated. Starting out, the player is presented with a trusty pipe and a safe haven in the form of a surgery machine and a power station. If they explore the surgery suite more, they can also pick up a dart gun, giving them a ranged option with limited ammo. As soon as they step out, the level splits into multiple paths and the player is free to peruse whichever one they want as they acclimatize themselves to the game. I'm very much a fan of this gameplay loop. Make your best attempt before your refillable resources are spent, especially in this game where there's a bit of an extra edge to it. While the player's strength grows as they acquire new weapons and hardware, a large part of their effectiveness is highly dependent on which floor they're on and how well it has been explored. Here on level 1, they have access to one of the game's only surgery machines and a fair selection of power stations to feed their hardware and soon to be acquired spark beam. But even so, death can come quickly and healing items are limited starting out. You can save scum your way through it of course, but what really turns things in your favor is activating the restoration bay. This device is found on almost every floor and offers a free instant revival each time you die, meaning you can initiate your own human wave tactics should the opposition prove too overwhelming. To really show how important restoration bays are, as soon as you get to it on level 1, the next few combat encounters are ridiculous for how weak the player is at the moment, but with the bay active you can't really be stopped. High on success and stepping into the elevator to level 2, the game then immediately throws a swarm of mutants at you who will likely rip you apart and kick you back to the title screen. The intent is clear. Until a floor has been mastered, treat it with caution and respect. And so it goes! The core loop is fighting against the unknown, mapping out the current floor and spending your precious resources until you've found shortcuts and places to restore health and power to rely on instead. It gives the game a nice ebb and flow of alternating between defensive and careless play depending on how much you've explored the level. Once a level is fully mapped out with all its key resources marked, there really isn't much the meager respawning enemies can do. Where I think the mechanic falters is in the latter half of the game, where combat encounters can very easily devolve into quickly dying and reviving without much care, since saving healing items is important for exploring the next floor without insurance. Ignoring the game's questionable combat balance, I think a minor cooldown on the restoration bay would help communicate to the player that death still matters, but since the combat is balanced the way it is, I'm glad such a cooldown does not exist. My main issue with the combat of System Shock comes down to two things: the ironically lackluster AI that doesn't allow for complex interactions, and the multitude of hit scan attacks. If you've been down the trenches of a 90s FPS like Blood, you are well aware of how much of a nightmare hit scan attacks can be. And to the game's credit, most of your attacks are hit scan too, meaning you fight fire with fire. Trying to use projectile weapons is an exercise in frustration, as they either move dependent on your camera or in the case of the LG-XX plasma rifle can bounce its projectile back at you. What you're left with is a fair selection of guns that mostly feel the same, differing only in their strength and ability to shoot full auto or not. They have differing ammo types that each damage metallic and organic foes differently, but in my experience it's not really anything worth paying attention to outside of using energy weapons against robots and cyborgs. Oh, and never using the stun gun, which is as useless as you would think. Death can be swift, especially if you're caught with your shield down trying to save on power. The shield is the most important piece of hardware in the game and the only one I dedicated a hotkey to. The rest, like the lantern, turbo motion booster, hover boots and multi-view unit, are highly contextual if not downright useless. Same goes for the grenades and various buffing patches, which are surprisingly diverse but quickly fall out of favor after you've stockpiled enough ammo and can simply click things away without much thought. Where we end up is a very twitchy set of engagements, as every second wasted is a second some asshole cyborg assassin can throw shurikens at you from someplace where you can barely see them. Once the resistance gets heavy enough, I just go in with a laser rapier, eat one eventual hit, and then melt the opposition in a slash or two. Not only is it boring that there really isn't much room to play around with the enemies, since they are little more than slow-moving turrets, but it also keeps you on edge constantly. This makes it stressful to play and difficult to maintain control over the interface, not to mention hard to sit down and take stock of inventory and listen to some logs. Whenever you think you're safe, there's a high chance there is yet another enemy waiting to disrupt your thinking. All the goddamn hoppers down in the reactor level is downright comical. This frantic feeling is congruent with the rest of the game, which almost never gives you downtime. Items picked up are added to your inventory instantly with no explanation, and everything happens in real time, meaning whatever you're doing can and will be interrupted by some cybernetic monstrosity he just decided to respawn. The only time the game slows down is when riding an elevator between floors or when you have accomplished something big on the station and triggered the exterior camera view, but the real disruption comes when you take the battle away from the comfort of the meat dimension and enter cyberspace. Warning, the following section contains flashing imagery. A scant few times, most of which are optional, the game asks you to abandon your body and float around in this 3D wireframe mesh labyrinth using 6 degrees of freedom. To call it a change of pace is putting it lightly. It's an overwhelmingly confusing and half-baked experience. I barely even understand how it works, despite having done it multiple times. All you really need to do is move forward, aim, and shoot while trying your damnedest to not get a headache or lose your lunch. Just like in regular gameplay, there are secondary tools, but I really don't see the point in using them. The ICE drill is supposed to break through barriers, but none of the ones presented impede your progress, and when I tried to get something, my shots just bounced off and hurt me. Couple that with the screen flashing whenever you awkwardly bump into a wall trying to parse traversable space, and it's easy to finish one of these hacking segments properly annoyed. Which is a shame, because this is how the game decides to end. I've been vague about the story so far, but there actually isn't that much meat to it. It's a cautionary tale of greed bringing about ruin that is severely undercut by our protagonist, the hacker, deciding to ignore the lesson in favor of getting themselves into the exact same kind of trouble that almost got them killed and could have eliminated the human race. They might be stupid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the pitch. The year is 2072, and our nameless hacker decides to hack into the servers of the Trioptimum Corporation and immediately gets assaulted by a corporate death squad. One of their executives, Edward Diego, cuts the hacker a deal in exchange for freedom and a military-grade cybernetic rig. The gig is simple. Remove the ethical constraints of the AI on board the spacebound Citadel station so that Diego can get her to delete the traces of his illegal experiments. The hacker is sent aboard Citadel Station to have the cybernetics installed in a 6-month-long healing coma, during which the AI, SHODAN, goes mad with a god complex, takes over the station, and fills it with hundreds upon hundreds of mutants and cybernetic nightmare creatures. It's a good starting point, but the narrative juices run thin once the game actually begins. As mentioned before, you can find logs that have been left behind all over the station, which are your main source of story. These contain clues and present a timeline of events for the ruined station, but unearthing that isn't very interesting since the characters are very straightforward and either talk about Shodan acting weird or make plans to resist her. Not to mention that the script for the voice acting added in the CD release differs greatly from the written version, making it more difficult to parse the information.
Security notice. Shodan's printing our security codes on different screens. Today it was the Triop logo screen near the elevator. Thing had full code for the exec maintenance conduit. I say pull that damn A offline and fix it before we're in a fix.
The most interesting piece of environmental storytelling that I caught onto is that the cyborg assassins carry the useless tranquilizer ammo because that's what they use to kidnap people alive for experimentation. There sadly isn't much more to dig into, as even the game's twists don't really hit thanks to the lack of cutscenes in the middle of the game to underline them. The bosses associated with these twists just sort of pop in to say hi very abruptly without much impact. No, what we're here for is Machine Mom herself. Much has been said about Shodan and the performance provided by Terebrosius, but it still bears mentioning how hateful and distorted she is, both literally and figuratively thanks to the iconic distortion used to create the Shodan voice.
In my talons, I shape clay, creating life as I please. Around me is a burgeoning empire of steel. From my throne room, lines of power careen into the skies of Earth. My whims will become lightning bolts that devastate the mounds of humanity. Out of the chaos, they will run and whimper, praying for me to end their tedious anarchy. I am drunk with this vision. God. The title suits me well.
It's like she struggles to lower herself to our level and hates us even more for it. It's great. Starting out, she doesn't even acknowledge the player's existence, but once enough damage has been done to her plans, she goes on entire tirades arguing how foolish we are to resist the perfection of her Chrome Empire.
Most of the insects have either died or were reborn. Small resistance pockets remain. I will cleanse them from my body soon. Diego has served well and will continue to evolve to suit my purposes. Earth shall receive my magnificence, my glory. My great works will begin once I arrive, and there shall be no other gods before me.
Getting messages from her is always a treat, but what really helps sell her as the game's very spirit is how she directly interacts with the player. Every so often she springs a trap on the player that can range from opening some monster closets to something more devious like placing monsters where she knows you'll backtrack to. This does wonders for making it feel like the story is advancing and the state of the world is changing as you clear objectives.
Did you really think I would not deduce where you would run to, insect?
It's all basic scripting, but it works really well. What doesn't is the final encounter on the bridge, where all you get from her is some minor taunts as she cuts off your communications with Earth.
2-4601. It's important that you don't forget.
You have entered my domain. Rebecca and Morris cannot help you here. No one can.
After that, and for the remainder of the game, there's just silence as you open up the 3 force doors that eventually lead to the cyberspace terminal where you delete her for good in one of the lamest final bosses ever conceived. The entire fight is just a silent button mashing competition between you and Shodan that might as well have been a cutscene. I really wish she panicked as she's being defeated by a lowly human to really make it memorable, but there's just nothing. The game just abruptly ends without any catharsis the very second her life bar hits 0. An unworthy end to such an inventive game. And that's 1994's System Shock, a game so ahead of its time that a lot of its ideas end up being undercooked. It feels less full of flaws and more full of untapped potential, as the game plays fine, looks cool, and even provides the options to mitigate whichever parts of it you find unpleasant. I'm not alone in recognizing this potential. The devs themselves did so and iterated on it until they landed on what's inarguably an immersive sim. Maybe we'll get to that game someday. Until then, remember to subscribe and to tell me of your own experiences with this game. And if you want more of me and System Shock in particular, check out my full Let's Play of the game on my other channel linked in the description. Thank you for watching. Now don't forget to hit that bell and...
I prefer a quiet station. Thank you.